morning and welcome to this African Business Energy Series webinar. I'm David Thomas, the editor of African Business. 2024 has been another milestone year for Africa's energy sector, marked by the continuing expansion of renewable energy, the ongoing debate over the role of hydrocarbons and transition fuels, and the long-awaited commissioning of Nigeria's Dangote refinery. With Africa's energy sector undergoing profound change, many countries are presented with significant opportunities to expand energy availability for their populations and reshape their economies. At this critical juncture, we will hear from President Macky Sall, the fourth president of Senegal and chairman of the Macky Sall Foundation, who will be discussing Africa's energy sector with a focus on strategic challenges and opportunities. Later, we'll hear from a panel of investors and experts on their experiences this year and their expectations for the energy space in 2025. But first, my colleague Ben Payton, Energy and Infrastructure Reporter at African Business, is going to set the context by walking us through some of the major trends and events of 2024. Ben, over to you.
Thank you, David. Thank you for having me. And I'm going to go through some of the key events in the African energy sector this year, both in renewables and in oil and gas. So with renewables, one of the really interesting trends, I think, is that investors and developers from the Gulf countries are increasingly looking to make significant investment in African projects. So, for example, we've seen the Saudi Arabia-based Amea Power working on the Benban project in Egypt. That's going to be the largest in Africa with a capacity of 1,000 megawatts plus 600 megawatt hours of battery storage. And the UAE-based developer Mazda is looking to develop 10 gigawatts of renewable energy in Africa by 2030. And its latest investment is a 200 megawatt wind power project also in Egypt. One thing to bear in mind, though, is that these very large investors typically look to deploy capital into very large projects, meaning that their investments are typically in the largest African markets, particularly South Africa, Egypt, Morocco, and a host of medium-sized countries as well. Now, in South Africa, it's certainly been a better year for the power sector than South Africa has seen for quite some time. So in 2023, the country had blackouts almost daily, but there's been no load shedding this year since late March. That's mainly due to coal-fired power stations running more smoothly, as well as solar power projects coming online. And investors have been keen to take part in the Independent Power Producers IPP program for renewable energy. In the current licensing round, the government wants to procure a combined 5 gigawatts from solar and wind power projects. And the latest round has been heavily oversubscribed on the solar side, which certainly points to robust investor confidence. And the winning bidders from that are set to be announced quite imminently. It's also worth pointing out that South Africa secured a $300 million investment in April from the UK-based investor Rolake for the biggest standalone battery system in Africa. And the scale of that project, I think, really points to how battery storage is playing an increasingly critical role in balancing the grid in African countries as solar and wind generation takes off. Now, one of the major bottlenecks for renewable energies is the lack of grid infrastructure to get power to where it's actually needed. McKinsey estimates that $400 billion is needed across Africa by 2050 for transmission and distribution. And that has historically been the responsibility of utilities, many of which are dealing with significant financial problems. So governments are increasingly looking to bring in the private sector to help fund these projects. In South Africa, for example, the government is working on a pilot project with the International Finance Corporation to secure private sector investment in transmission, much as the IPP scheme for solar and wind generation has been quite successful in securing private sector investment. We're also seeing more focus on grid interconnections between countries so that countries can export or import power from renewables according to what's needed and available. So the Southern African Power Pool and Climate Fund Managers launched a new fund in March this year they're seeking to raise $1.3 billion from private sector investments to help finance new interconnections across the 12 countries that are part of that power pool. And one of the other really important trends is the growth of distributed solar, so projects that supply power directly to power users independently of the grid. Power-intensive industries see installing renewable energy as a good way to save costs, improve their security of supply, and also demonstrate their sustainability credentials. And then developers like working with those industrial clients because they see them as reliable off-takers. Some of the big projects this year include Saudi-based Aqua Power. It recently signed a deal to supply 500 megawatts of wind energy to a gigafactory that's being built in Morocco. And in February, Masdar agreed a deal with DP World to install wind and solar power and battery storage port operations, including in Egypt and Senegal. Also, South Africa has seen a huge surge in commercial and industrial and in household solar over the past few years, while load shedding has been going on. So distributed solar generation has doubled to 6.1 gigawatts just in the last 2 years, which really highlights how quickly this trend is taking off. Also, several countries are pursuing other low-carbon energy sources. So Africa's second nuclear power station currently being built in Egypt. Several other countries have signed memorandums of understanding, particularly with Russia, to explore nuclear power development. Kenya is probably in the lead at the moment. It's identified 2 possible locations for nuclear reactors, although questions over whether its ambition to have nuclear energy within the next 10 years is looking optimistic. Kenya is also the leading country with geothermal in Africa. Its latest power station, also being built by Rolake, is due to be completed next year. And there's also a steady stream across Africa of hydro projects coming online. One which I think is really interesting is the Rolake project in Madagascar, which is believed to be approaching financial close. And that's designed to increase the country's electricity supply by 20%, which shows how significant hydro can be in helping to close the supply gap. In the oil and gas sector, it's been a relatively slow year. There's only been a handful of projects that have reached a final investment decision in 2024, including a couple of projects led by TotalEnergies in Nigeria and Angola. There are believed to be several major projects which are quite close to FID, including in Nigeria and Senegal. So 2025 may be a busier year, although Exxon has delayed FID on the LNG project in Mozambique to 2026. On the LNG side, Congo-Brazzaville shipped its first cargo in February this year. That's an Italian-led project helping Europe to meet its gas supply needs. And another important development was Angola officially withdrawing from OPEC on the 1st of January in a row over quotas. And that could, in theory, allow Angola to increase its production in the coming years, now that it's no longer subject to those OPEC quotas. The availability of finance is one of the key constraints for governments and oil and gas companies looking to develop projects in Africa. And that's partly because of doubts over the future of global oil and gas demand, which in some cases is leading to questions over whether the really enormous development costs can be justified commercially. But it also reflects environmental concerns. So most European development finance institutions, which are typically the major funders for infrastructure projects in Africa, have very tight restrictions against funding oil and gas projects. And some commercial banks have also been reluctant to support the sector. So in October, we saw the 18-country African Petroleum Producers Organization, along with Afrexim Bank, announcing a project to create an Africa Energy Bank, which would be able to step in as a lender for these oil and gas projects. And that's seeking a capitalization of $5 billion initially. Finally, in the downstream sector, the really big news is the coming online of the Dangote refinery in Nigeria, which started to deliver refined gasoline in September. And that's been very highly anticipated for a number of years. It's been seen as the key to solving the problem where Nigeria is an exporter of crude oil, but a major importer of more expensive refined fuels. So that coming online, a very exciting development for Nigeria. The first few months of operations have been a bit bumpy, various rows with the government over the continued importation of cheaper, low quality imports, which Dangote says is undercutting demand. And so the refinery has actually agreed to start exporting some of its cargoes, as well as supplying the Nigerian market. So that completes the tour of the African energy landscape this year. And David, I'll hand it back to you.
Sure, thanks very much, Ben. Obviously, that presentation gives us a really valuable overview of the year. Clearly, a huge amount going on, particularly in renewables. And there's also a lot to mull over there, I think, especially with hydrocarbons and finance. So we'll discuss that a lot this morning. But first, I mean, we're very pleased to be joined by former Senegal President Macky Sall, who led the country from 2012 to 2024 through an immensely significant period of development for the country's oil and gas sector. He'll be speaking to my colleague Omar Ben Yedder, the Managing Director at African Business. This interview will be conducted in French, but there is an English translation available. So simply click on the globe at the bottom of your screen and choose English. Over to you, Omar.
David, thank you so much.
Excellency, we're delighted to have you with us today. As my colleague just said, you were present from 2012 to 2024, and I think that during your presidency, you were president of infrastructure, so you really focused on infrastructure development, and you were one of the chairs that you were leading in Pan-African infrastructure development, and the African Development Bank, when you saw your beginning of your first mandate, and you said, look, Mr. African Development Bank President, we need you. We need infrastructure on roads, airports, and other roads. And you were ready with projects in your hand, and the amount that you need and the financial agreement for deploying them, your plan of investment, you had a vision. And in fact, and for energy as well, Mr. President, I would like to ask you, do the different African countries that we're talking about, do they still need investment? They don't always have projects ready to go for investment. What was your strategy? And for more than 10 years in government before president, what's advice that you could give to different African countries to attract more investors? What are the key factors for success to financing your needs in infrastructure? And we're going to talk about energy particularly. Thank you very much indeed. Good day to everybody today. I would like to greet everybody who is here today and would like to thank you for this discussion of a very important theme for the African continent. Energy is the motor of development, and I'm very all the more happy to talk about this sector as I was Minister of Energy, and before that I had the privilege of running the national energy petrol company of Senegal in Dakar. And for other African countries who are concentrated, it's one of the key fundamental development elements. I would like to reply to your question, which is very relevant, and to congratulate you on the presentation that was just made on the situation, the current situation in Africa. And I share entirely the ideas expressed in the presentation. I'd like to draw your attention to the fact when we're talking about energy, we need to talk about renewable energies. Africa is committed completely to renewable energy, but as you know, to make sure we have development, we need basic resources, the cheapest energy available. And because of that, all the countries in Africa need to, for some countries, we need, in Europe, they have nuclear energy or coal energy, and for others, it's gas. So we can't say that Africa, we can't deprive Africa of that capacity. And it would be an injustice and a fight against that. At the COP in Glasgow, we had all the industrialized countries, the polluting countries, who decided a sort of fatwa. It was that we were no longer going to finance fossil energies beyond our countries, in particular abroad. And that was felt like a climate injustice, which was serious and particularly serious for Africa, because it's a continent which produces the least, less than 4%, and is the least responsible for greenhouse gases. And the effects of the greenhouse gases, they were forbidden to finance its own energy using its own natural resources. And we know that we need resources, whether it's oil, gas, or hydroelectricity. We need renewable energies as well. But I would like to salute what was said in Africa, that great efforts are being made in the continent, because for the last 5 years, we went from zero to hundreds of megawatts of solar production or wind power production. So it's just a remark to say that we need to have a balanced approach on energy. And I think that I'm against that all the development banks who have, and the shareholders, they decided not to finance fossil fuels, whether it's the World Bank or the European Development Bank and even the African Development Bank. So fossil energies, what does that mean to them? They means exposes countries to difficulties to finding finance to develop oil and gas, and that's why the approach which showed that on financing oil and gas is relevant, because the development banks are no longer there, and the countries are obliged to approach the oil companies to finance that. And that's meant that investments have declined significantly. And so to come back to the case of Senegal, it's a case which is similar to other countries, and that we have a capacity of 500 megawatts, and I multiplied that by 3 years in my 10-year period. And in April, we were about 1,800 megawatts. How did we do that? We developed really as much as we could partnerships, IPP, independent power producing partnerships. So in Senegal, since 98, we went completely into this, and the national company could no longer invest in production because it was up to the private sector who was ready to invest in production. And so the state was going to kind of focus investment on the transmission, and this was also multiplied by 3 to 500 kilo to 1,500, and the state was also renewed infrastructures of distribution. We had much more energy needs. We needed to invest more and more so the high and low tension lines, and develop at the same time the electrification of rural areas. And so we needed have lower and high tension facilities to widen access to electricity. So all this was concentrated on a vision that I would call the vision for Senegal of emerging Senegal 2014 to 2034 20-year plan, of which was the first time we had 5-year plans. And this plan were 3 main pillars around the structural transformation and growth. And in the first pillar, which was the most important one for the investment, we had infrastructure, road, rail, ports, and we also had energy. We had also everything what was about production for the agricultural sector. The second pillar of this plan was that we didn't just build roads, we were also looking about people, so social inclusion, and we were concentrating on what we called human capital, the sustainable development and social protection. And that meant that projects which were developed were particularly to access to basic social services, so water, so electricity, energy, so reduction of the women's work and how the work was difficult. So all of these pillars, we had a specific program, emergency program for each of these areas for the different communities. So to give replies, so in rural areas, and which in general are the zones which are the most deprived. And we also had a focus on education and health to develop the capacities for education, universities, and 2 or 3 more university centers and higher education institutions. And also we developed health measures. And so this, while we were thinking about the long term for infrastructure on growth, we did not forget the first problem, the questions of social protection, which is fundamental. And the third pillar, the third part, was governance and on peace and security. So without peace or security, there is no development. So it was in this way that we developed all the text which stopped the Court of Counts from functioning and the courts from working properly. So we had the extractive industries involved, and we had a lot of success where there were annexed programs to this, whether we saw the notation of Senegal improving in a positive way. If you could call back your strategy on energy, because the development of how it's inclusive, what I call hard infrastructure, and everything was roads and the health and education and governance. But what was your strategy for the energy mix? Because Ben, he said something which was quite important for the foreign investors when they see the projects which everything is modulable. So for that, we have to also have the interaction from all the region. You talk about the Southern African power pool and the West African power pool. What is your strategy for the energy mix for renewables and concern on the oil and gas for export and for local consumption and regional consumption? What was your strategy in this? Thank you very much. So my first vision was given the variations of the cost of oil, so petrol. So the fact that the essential part of our energy came from fuel, from oil. So the consummate, we had to focus on a mix which was for the development of solar power in a very short time period. And we had more than 250 megawatts of solar and 70 megawatts of wind power. So it was really a revolution, and we worked a lot on the ECOWAS and the West African pool. And when I was minister in 2003, we were involved in this project, and that project worked from 2023, 24, and now the West African pool has 14,000. So we can continue to on diversification. And when we discovered in 2016 gas and petrol, we said the mix is going to be concentrated with wind, solar, and electricity production, because now we've got the Senegal River Basin, which is involved to organized and developed with Gambia. We have hydroelectric dams, and this we can share this energy. So the mix was now developed quite quickly over 5-6 years, and it meant that we were less independent on a particular source of energy, and we continued our efforts for over 3 years. We now had 31% of renewable energy. So where we are today, when we talk about fossils, it's not because we don't want progress on renewables, not at all. When we have signed a partnership with Just Energy Partnership Transition to commit to get to 40% of renewables in 2030 with $2.5 billion of investment. So if you like, we had to diversify our energy sources to be less vulnerable to the issues about oil, and to use gas. And our ambition was to, one, use gas that we have with Gentia gas with Mauritania. It was used mainly for export purposes, and mainly with a little bit of it which can be used to power station between Mauritania, and Senegal. And this is called the Yakatara oil deposit, and this is used mainly for internal consumption. So our program Gas to Power, we wanted to develop particularly production of ammonia and other productions. So this project is also used to find partners to be able to develop the capacity to 20%. And we could have for Senegal, but also to give energy to the West African power pool, to be able to provide power to countries who don't have their own production capacity. And I think we need to be supported on financing the transmission networks in Africa. And we need a system of exchanges so that we can have energy and exchange with the different countries in solidarity. So I saw a presentation now. We'd like to show the presentation. You can see here that it's interesting. The International Energy Agency, with the consumption of energy between now and 2030 and 2050. So the gas and nuclear is going to improve. We see also the petrol for our own consumption and production. There's going to be export. There's going to be some solar and other energies, but natural gas and petrol oil will continue to be very important in part of the mix. up to 2020, and renewable energies will obviously be involved as well. So following the Nairobi Declaration. Thank you for the slide. Thank you very much. We see that it's their coal is still involved and the other energies are declining. So coal is Morocco and South Africa are the main producers. Now, so last question we have, Your Excellency. We saw that the Afrim-Exim Bank co-financed some projects, local projects, and the last strategy of the African Development Bank for the transition fuels for the continent, we saw what on this side to finance use their own resource to be able to develop some of its energy sources and the development. I expect you're pleased with that. Yes, indeed. The efforts of the African Development Bank are great. I welcome them, and I welcome the work done. I welcome also the leadership of the Afrim-Exim Bank, who has done good work, and we have to work with African countries on gas in particular, because gas is a transition energy, and we know that our situation moving towards a decarbonized economy, we need an evolution, a transition, and during the transition we have to finance these energies, these transition energies, gas particularly, and we also need to finance the renewable energies. We saw that if you take today the Barrister Eninga, the dam, or the third or half of energy needs in Africa we can use. And we have also that all the partners are involved in the mega projects or the giga projects, and everybody needs to get involved. And I think the African Development Bank and Afrim-Exim Bank are great African partners, and also the World Bank as well, because we can't not support African countries. It's absolutely fundamental. And we have nearly the half of the African population of African. We need to give them electricity and renewable energies and fossil fuels, gas, and they have to have this person looking forward to 2050 when they're reduced. And that's how we can succeed. We just for Africa, and that's why I'm advocating for that for renewables. But we have to have basic energy, and this energy must be financed by the states and by partners. Your Excellency, thank you very much for your contribution, David. We're delighted to have you today, and I would like to give the floor back to David. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much. That was a fascinating discussion. I think I was particularly struck by President Sall's insistence that Africa should be able to exploit its basic energy resources, as well as moving forward with renewables. And I think that's going to be a key theme of the conversation I'm about to have with our expert panel. So thank you very much, President Macky, Sall and Omar. Turning to the panel today, I'm joined by Dr. Daniel Alexander Schroth, Director for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency at the African Development Bank, Cheick-Omar Diallo, Leader Task Force Communication Engagement at TotalEnergies Exploration and Production Africa, and Rolake Akinkugbe-Filani, Non-Executive Director and Member of the Investment Committee at Allon, which is a renewable investment company. Welcome all. There should be some time after the panel for an audience Q&A session, so please post your questions in the box, and we'll try to get to as many as we can once the discussion is concluded. I think we'll start by looking back on 2024, which has been a fascinating year, and then we'll go into more detail, perhaps discuss some of the topics that President Sall touched upon. I think first I'm going to turn to Cheick-Omar at TotalEnergies, which is obviously one of the biggest oil and gas exploration and production companies in Africa. Welcome, Cheick-Omar. I mean, from your company's perspective, what were some of the three major events and themes that you've seen in the African energy space this year?
Thank you, David. Thank you also to Excellency Macky for this bright presentation. And thank you to all the participants to this webinar. For TotalEnergies, what I can say that to talk about 2024, it is really for me important maybe to give a few words about the company's strategy. Today, this strategy, it is based on two pillars: more energy, less emissions. This means that shifting from CO2 emitting project to less emitting project, with, as it has been said by Her Excellency Mr. Macky Sall, going to the LNG, going to the gas as a transition energy. So for the company, the main events and most important events, I will not mention all of them because it might be too long, but I can say maybe for the current portfolio, we did launch in Nigeria some projects. For example, there is an ACPO project in Nigeria. In Angola, we signed the FID for the Block 20. This is mostly for oil and gas for the current portfolio. For exploration, we did continue in 24 our exploration phase in Namibia with Venus and Tamboti. And for the project which are under development, there is the project in Uganda, the Tilenga Inco project. So we did continue the construction of the facility. This is talking about the oil and gas. In renewables, we do have also a strong strategy worldwide. It is by investing roughly 4 to 6 billion USD per year in renewable. So we do apply this strategy to Africa. In Africa, we did launch a new project. We do have in Africa today some projects under operation, for example, in South Africa, in Mozambique, and so on. And we did launch also a new project. We do have projects under development. It is a case we talked about a few minutes ago about Senegal. It is a case of Senegal. We did have some solar project under development, under study. We do have the same in Congo. So we did also make some operation in renewables. And finally, and it was stressed a few minutes ago, again by Excellency, it is to give also access to electricity and to clean cooking. And we launched, our CEO launched an initiative in last May 24 to give access to clean cooking to 100 million people in Africa and India. Because in addition to those who don't have access to electricity, half of the continent, we do have more than half to the continent who don't have access to clean cooking. So we are investing also a significant amount in this area. So these are, I will not mention all because I will be too long, but I can tell that these are some of the most important events or action in 24.
Sure, thanks very much, Cheick-Omar. Turning to Dr. Schroth at the African Development Bank, it's clearly been another very busy year for energy investments at the bank, especially in renewables. Perhaps you could talk us through a few of your highlights for 2024.
Sure. Thank you very much, David. It's a pleasure being here, and this is an important session looking at what happened in 2024 and also the way forward 2025. Looking at our investments on the African Development Bank side, this year focused actually on the various kind of pillars of the energy sector value chain. So we had a number of investments in new generation capacity across sort of different renewable energy technologies, from hydro to solar, including solar with battery storage, which is becoming more and more important to be able to integrate more variable renewables, as well as wind. For example, we approved just 10 days ago the 1.1 gigawatt Suez wind project in Egypt with Aqua Power, which is sort of in line with what Ben has been highlighting around the sort of emergence of particularly investors from the Gulf countries. We also approved a 120 megawatt wind project in Namaja in Mozambique with Rolake as sort of as the developer. We've also been continued focus on investing in sort of the required transmission and distribution infrastructure that is so critically important, particularly also from the perspective of integrating more renewables into interconnected grids. Example that we approved just a year ago is a 1,400 kilometer interconnection between Mauritania and Mali, but also is then electrifying kind of the people alongside the transmission line, and also has sort of solar power plants sort of integrated in the design of the project. So it's really a corridor development priority. We will hopefully approve this Friday another important interconnection between Uganda and South Sudan. But these are just some examples of our investments in transmission and distribution infrastructure. I think one other key priority that we are focusing on is the whole decentralized renewables energy market, but also access to clean cooking. And Sheikh Diallo referred to the commitments made in May, which was the Paris Clean Cooking Summit that we co-organized with the International Energy Agency, Norway, and the government of Tanzania, sort of to shed kind of more light on the need for investments in clean cooking. I think two last comments I would like to make. First, this year has been a record year for investments from our concessional window, from our largest in-house blended finance facility, our Sustainable Energy Fund for Africa. We will be exceeding $100 million in concessional investments, both taking sort of junior equity positions into funding structures or providing concessional loans to bring projects towards bankability and financial close. One example is the 25 megawatt Ilute project solar project in Zambia, which is the first project sort of to benefit from the Africa Queenco aggregator model, and will actually be selling into the Southern African power pool, which is quite innovative in terms of sort of reducing kind of the reliability or kind of relying just solely on the off-takers, the national utilities. And the last point is we've also created this year and sort of just about to achieve first financial close is the Alliance for Green Infrastructure in Africa, AGIA, which also focuses quite strongly on energy. It's a project development fund, sort of really trying to address sort of the challenge of getting enough bankable projects. So AGIA project development is managed by Africa 50, and it's sort of been strong support from key partners, including the G7. So these are some of the highlights that I could mention from our side.
Sure, thanks very much, Dr. Schroth. Welcome, Rolake. Obviously, you're also very heavily involved in renewables. I'm particularly interested to hear from you a little more kind of regionally focused. What's going on in Nigeria and the wider West African region at the moment? How are you seeing things play out in that space over 2024?
Okay, thank you very much, and great to be here. I think maybe I will start by touching a bit on the macro. I mean, one of the biggest trends we're seeing in the last 12 to 24 months has been the devaluation of the local currency and the strength of the US dollar. And I think that has had implications for both energy producers as well as net importers of energy because of the then pass-through effect on inflation. So we're seeing high energy prices across the board, on the one hand, on the demand side, but also on the production and supply side, and particularly in terms of attracting financing and investments. Transaction financing costs and capital costs have actually increased across the board. If you want to segment that along the lines of oil and gas, renewable energy, or gas infrastructure projects, I think on the upstream side, most of those projects have been dollar funded, but also dollar tied receipts. And I think where we've had a real challenge is with companies that have been earning their revenues in local currencies who have struggled to repay their debts. And I think one of the really interesting trends we will see going forward is with the advent and expansion of renewables, particularly in the local market, where you have a great deal more localization in many parts of the value chain. We will start to see more fundraising, and we're certainly seeing that in our parts of what we do at Olon. Olon has, over the last 4 to 5 years, raised in excess of $50 million local currency equivalent to finance off-grid and distributed renewable energy projects and ventures. And I'll come back to that in a bit. The second thing that I wanted to touch broadly on in terms of the macro landscape for the energy sector is the shifting corporate landscape. And we've seen this very strongly in Nigeria. In the last 12 months, there have been maybe 4 to 5 major deal announcements. And we've been talking about the fact that local energy companies have been playing more at the forefront of energy production. But we've seen a handful of deals and acquisitions happen. And I think that's because the trend is pretty clear. Indigenous and African-focused companies are stepping up and will play a bigger role in onshore, in shallow water, upstream hydrocarbons. And it's not just a Nigerian phenomenon. We see this in Angola. We see this in other more established hydrocarbons producers in Africa. So you've had that macroeconomic trend, which has led to an FX squeeze with a premium and more focus on localization. Now, if we look more at the sort of energy transition and downstream, the renewable energy space, the biggest shift I have seen in terms of funding and the structure of the industry is the need to bring on more off-grid capacity and decentralized systems. Now, we're not just talking about sort of last mile distribution of energy, but we're seeing more and more within the commercial and industrial space, a shift towards more hybrid solutions and hybrid systems. And certainly within our portfolio at Olon, we've got quite a few companies who are not just now doing residential solar, but are also now pivoting into commercial and industrial solar. I think one of the areas that has really struggled is the utility scale renewable energy, which we haven't really seen in the West African market, at least certainly in Nigeria, due to the large-scale infrastructure requirements that are needed. But we've certainly seen that momentum towards the DRE space and specifically the mini-grid space. I think both in terms of the interconnected mini-grids and the standalone mini-grids. And I think there's now more regulatory alignment on how the different energy producers in that part of the market can work together. The final thing I will say really at this stage is the changing regulatory and fiscal landscape. Many countries across the continent of Africa are facing a fiscal squeeze in terms of budget deficits, looking for ways to fund their budget deficits. And a key area of focus, unfortunately, because of its high profile, has been the energy sector, but it's not the sole focus of governments and regulators. And so we've seen some countries struggle to achieve a balance between a balanced tax regime for the energy space and a regime that will attract more investment. Thankfully, in Nigeria, with the passing of the Petroleum Industry Act and some of the additional policy tools that have been rolled out by the government of President Bola Ahmed Tinubu, we've seen now greater incentives, particularly in the deep offshore production for the upstream space. In the renewable space, there are now more friendly fiscal and tax incentives to attract investments, and especially for the local assembly of solar components, solar equipment. And so what we will see in 2025, I think, is a broadening of the ecosystem around renewable energy. More localization will be inevitable as a risk management strategy for many players in that space, beyond money that is being given by multilateral finance institutions and DFIs like the African Development Bank. I think we'll see more venture capital in the venture space, so the entrepreneurial space, where there is a need for projects to scale. And many of those projects will need to look at more innovative structures, such as aggregation of carbon credits, decarbonization projects, and not just decarbonization within the clean energy space, but decarbonizing oil and gas production, which could then help African countries reduce emissions, whilst also helping them achieve their ESG and social license goals. And I think I'll leave it there for now. Thank you.
Rolake. I mean, clearly there's huge momentum in renewables, as Rolake and Dr. Schroth just alluded to. But as we saw also from Ben's presentation, on the other hand, there's still going to be that ongoing demand for oil. And as President Sall said, as he insisted, Africa should be able to continue using traditional resources alongside renewables. Cheick-Omar, obviously, Total is heavily involved in the traditional hydrocarbons market, but is also pivoting towards renewable energy expansion. So, how are you helping to redress that balance and kind of get the balance right between traditional resources that President Sall would like to see us use and also new renewable energy technologies?
Okay, thank you, David. I believe, and it has been said, that both are necessary today, because for some people in Africa, we are talking about switching from nothing to green energy. It is not switching from charcoal or LPG to green energy. It is from nothing. So the issue now is, and I think that we are more pragmatic today. The issue is how we build today in Africa a just transition energy, and how all international stakeholder actors, could be international private companies or the DFI, how do they comply with this? Africa will have its own, I believe, its own pace. That is to say, relying on the development of oil and gas projects, because Africa needs to launch new oil and gas project for two reasons: to get financial resources and to get also access to energy and to electricity for their people. So for TotalEnergies, we do comply with this, or we are aligned and consistent with this strategy, saying that we need to continue in developing new oil and gas field, and at the same time to invest in renewable energies. Just maybe to say why we need to develop new oil and gas project. Because today, you can see that the demand of oil and gas is increasing. It is increasing because in the South, in Asia, Africa, and so on, we need more oil, we need more gas. And if we take the current field in operation, we have what we call a natural decline of 4% of the production per year. So if you do not invest today in new fields, you will have a gap between the supply and the demand. This is why we continue to invest in new oil and gas. But by saying investing in new oil and gas, we are saying also investing in less CO2 projects. For example, in Uganda, the project we do develop is, in terms of GHG emission, one of the lowest in Africa and even worldwide. Just to give you the figures, today in operation, oil field emits 33 kilograms of CO2 per barrel today, roughly. And for Uganda, it will be 30 kilograms, 13 kilograms per barrel. So we are far below. So we do invest in low emission field, low CO2 field. And as I was saying in my introduction, we do also invest in renewable energy. So we are tackling both. We are dealing with the two. Just to jump in 1 minute to what Rolake said about renewable, I am fully aligned with her. Today we are facing different challenges. It is about regulation. It is about investment in the transmission. It is about investment in the grid. It is about also today the perception of the investors, and I think that is really familiar with this. That is to say, investors they do think that it is highly risky to invest in Africa today in energy. So there's this feeling from the investors. And finally, at the end of the day, also there is affordability of the consumer to pay the bill. So we have to work on also on that. That is to say, giving the means to people, because it is not just by saying we'll give them access to electricity, because we know that some people cannot afford to pay LPG or to pay electricity at the end of the day. So how do we tackle also at the end of the day this issue?
Well, thank you. Dr. Schroth, obviously, as someone who is principally involved in renewables and for an institution which over time has promised to phase out fossil fuel investments, it'd be interesting to hear your view on this. I think President Sall also mentioned that his disappointment that multilaterals are focusing on renewable energy rather than a broader portfolio. But how is the African Development Bank striking this balance?
Well, thank you very much for the question. Indeed, I mean, the strategy of the bank is sort of moving towards more green growth, more inclusive growth. And we have been sort of expanding sort of our share of renewables as part of sort of total generation investments at the bank. So excluding some of the ones that were just approved this year, since 2016, I think sort of 87% of our investments were in renewables. Having said that, and I think it was alluded to earlier, we do recognize that in certain kind of markets and constituencies, there is a role for natural gas as a transition fuel. So we recognize that this is sort of part of the equation, but we have certainly an emphasis on sort of looking into sort of alternatives to fossil fuel power generation by also increasing investments in sort of renewable kind of baseload technologies where they are available, whether that's geothermal, for example. You mentioned Kenya as a good example, but alongside the entire East African Rift Valley, looking at the significant hydropower potential, and not only sort of greenfield hydropower, but also looking at the refurbishment of existing hydropower. We did recently a study with the International Hydropower Association in the context of our Africa Hydropower Modernization Program that highlighted that there's around 10 gigawatt of existing hydropower generation capacity in urgent need of refurbishment. So there's kind of almost a low-hanging fruit sort of to revitalize those hydropower stations, look at opportunities, for example, bringing in solar sort of on kind of the dams or floating solar, sort of to increase kind of the capacity of those sources. So that's kind of clearly sort of the direction of travel that we see, but we recognize that there is a need in certain kind of circumstances for continued support and investment, particularly in natural gas, also from the aspect of sort of looking at the gap in terms of access to clean cooking solution that was alluded to earlier, where particularly LPG is certainly part of the equation in terms of addressing the gap of almost 1 billion people in Africa not having access to clean cooking solutions. I think clearly from our side going forward, and it was mentioned, it hasn't been mentioned yet, but our focus is on addressing the energy access deficit. We have just launched this year as a major development with the World Bank Group, what is called Mission 300, a commitment from both institutions to work jointly to provide access to 300 million Africans by 2030, in collaboration with all other stakeholders. And we're working at the moment towards an energy summit in Tanzania at the end of January. And also where we've been working with 14 initial countries, but with the intention to expand to other countries around energy compacts that would address a number of the shortcomings and challenges that investors see in the energy sector. And I think Rolake and Cheick referred to several of them, whether that's sort of off-taker risk, utility reform, the currency and exchange rate risks that are prevalent in many countries, the regulatory legislative challenges that we're seeing. We kind of consider that those compacts fully endorsed at the head of state level at the summit, and then with the kind of the full weight of both the World Bank, ourselves, and other partners that are joining us in this journey, can really make a difference.
Sure. Rolake, it's clearly a very difficult tightrope for some countries to walk, because obviously there's the COP29 process overall, which is bringing pressure on hydrocarbons producers, and there's also pressure from investors who are, in some instances being advised by shareholders not to go down the route of hydrocarbons investments. With so many pressures, how can African countries make the right decisions when it comes to getting that balance right? It's a very difficult area for a lot, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've kind of most African stakeholders in the private and public sector, I think, have a pragmatic approach, and I think that's already been well established. We are where we are. We need to utilize what we have to grow, but I think we also need to think more creatively. First of all, I would say oil and gas reinvestment, and this is work both for the private sector and public sector. Is hydrocarbons will still dominate the West African economy. If there are new fields coming upstream in different countries, travel as far as Namibia, which is now a major global offshore hotspot. And the question is, how do we reinvest those revenues into more sustainable forms of energy so both can coexist side by side? That's number one. The second one is we need to really start looking at more creative hybrid energy projects where you're developing large-scale oil and gas infrastructure that's powered by solar, or you're using LPG and integrating that into a fully renewable form of energy infrastructure. And I think those are the ways we need to think more creatively around how we do this. And then we have to match the energy needs to the specific segment of the market. Last mile communities will always struggle to get on grid. We were talking about upgrading our grid infrastructure, upgrading our utilities, some of the issues there. But some renewable energy solutions work really well for last mile distributed hubs. But when you look at large scale industrial needs and capacity, then baseload power fueled by gas will still be the mainstay and the most sustainable form, at least in the near term, for those industries. So a lot of it will be collaboration between the public and the private sector and more strategic national and economic planning. We're seeing some countries that are now sort of integrating energy solutions into trade hubs and free zones, which can then drive broader manufacturing and large-scale industrialization. I once heard this joke, you probably heard it before, this bid and push for Africa to decarbonize. Somebody said, we haven't even started industrializing and we're being asked to decarbonize. It's not a linear thing, right? And I think even in terms of the way we look at financing, we need to look at financing, blended finance that addresses the broad spectrum of our energy needs and the needs of African populations.
Sure, thank you. Cheick-Omar, how are you finding the financing environment at the moment, particularly for the hydrocarbons projects, but also for the renewable projects that you're looking at? What are some of are you starting to see an investor wariness when it comes to large-scale oil and gas at the moment, or are investors still keen to get involved?
Yes, for the financing we have talked about, I think, we should make the difference. I think that among the oil and gas project and the renewables, for the oil and gas, it is, I think that for some projects it is quite difficult to get finance. And for Africa, and we said, and it was said by President Macky Sall, it is so somewhere kind of injustice for Africa, because as it was stressed, Africa did not contribute to the climate change, but Africa is paying the double bill. Is suffering from climate change and not getting access to funds. So Africa is paying the double bill. So for oil and gas, yes, we may face some difficulties. Now for renewables, it is not the same difficulties. I think that there is a lot of money to be invested in renewables, but as we were saying that some investors, they are afraid about Africa. They think that it is highly risky to invest in Africa. And even if you take the amount of money going to renewable, it is really smaller. For Africa, it is roughly less than 5% of the global amount invested today in renewable energies. So when we are talking about 3 or 5%, it is nothing. It is nothing in terms of amount. So they think that it is risky. It is risky for the project in terms of being paid. It is risky because there is a lot of investment to be done in the grid, as it was stressed. So because it is risky, they don't invest, or even when they do invest, the interest rate is really high. So getting funds for renewables is also difficult, but it is not for the same reasons. So at the end of the day, it is really challenging for Africa to get access, and this is the reason why we do have initiatives launched by the DFI, by the African Development Bank. It was mentioned also the World Bank investing, because it is really difficult to get to attract private sector in this international private sector.
Sure, thanks. Obviously, Dr. Schroth, renewables financing is a whole other set of challenges, and I think some of our questions from the audience have alluded to for example, foreign currency challenges being one of the bottlenecks when it comes to renewables. Maybe you could put that in context and talk a bit about the financing difficulties, but also the opportunities, through the COP and other processes to crowd in more funds?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think Diallo referred to some of the challenges. If we look at the financing flows, I think this year, well, 2023 was a record year in terms of new renewable energy generation capacity worldwide. Only 1.6% of that was in Africa. So there's clearly a very significant gap. What is even more striking to me is if you look at statistics that sort of compare sort of renewable energy investment per capita between particularly sub-Saharan Africa and sort of other parts of the world, that gap, rather than closing, has actually been widening over the years. So there is clearly a need for additional efforts, additional investment, also kind of concessional resources, whether that's climate finance, and it links back to the conversations around COP and sort of the new kind of quantitative climate finance goal, but also in terms of addressing obviously some of the risks and addressing some of the wrong risk perceptions. I mean, the aspect of perceived risk is very significant. It's not backed by the actual situation on the ground. I think my president is always referring to Moody Analytics statistics that clearly highlight that if you look at infrastructure defaults in worldwide, sort of over 20 years, actually had at the lowest kind of percentage compared to any other region in the world. So I think we need to work on those various aspects in parallel. That's not to say that there are risks that need to be addressed, and the foreign exchange risk is certainly one of them. I think, well, there's no panacea to it. We're looking into ways to increase, on the one side, our local currency financing, but also kind of strengthening kind of institutions that can provide that financing at the national level. I think Nigeria is a good kind of case in point, where we have supported, for example, the Nigeria Infrastructure Debt Fund that sort of is able to provide funding, debt financing in local currency in Nigeria. Similarly, we've been supporting, working with InfraCredit sort of as another kind of a structure that can sort of provide that funding and also bring in institutional capital, particularly from Nigerian pension funds, into the market. So I think we need to accelerate and expand sort of these type of solutions to address that kind of currency mismatch that is prevalent in quite a number of markets.
Sure. Rolake, how is All-On tackling some of these difficulties and making sure that the money gets into the projects that really needs it?
Okay, I think some of it has been said already, but one of the initiatives that All-On is working on in partnership with the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet is the launch of what is called a Global Aggregated Procurement Program, the DART program. And what essentially that does, it combines demand pooling and aggregating purchasing of solar equipment, access to affordable financing, coordinating logistics across a diverse range of projects. The program is supported by an initial facility from a DFI, which then helps to unlock further private sector funding for the individual projects. Now, that's just one creative example. I think, more broadly speaking, it's really looking at ways to enhance the attractiveness of individual projects, right? Through partnering, working with large-scale financiers of renewable energy across the continent. And I think the other thing that's also being done is the demand side, which we often forget. A large part, even for distributed and off-grid solutions, is off-taker risk. And we often sometimes forget how people will afford to pay for the energy that's being produced or supplied. And so actually finding risk management solutions that speak to the demand side, that introduce types of consumer finance schemes that then enable those projects to become viable from a commercial perspective is also very interesting. And then more broadly, I also wanted to touch on the part of local funding. I mean, Africa does have over $100 billion in pension funds. And we're seeing now some interesting trends where many of these pension funds are moving away from more traditional asset classes to infrastructure asset classes, some of which are then packaged and listed on markets, tradable markets. They create some sort of arm's length approach for investors who have low risk appetites. So I think that's also interesting. We need to be looking at a broad spectrum of solutions. The blended finance option, I think, is also interesting. At All-On, we're not just looking at equity funding, We're looking at convertible debt. We're looking at credit as well, depending on the risk profile of each individual venture. So I think it's really solutions that are firing off in different directions, depending on the risk profile and the long-term benefit or impact of the project from both a social and a governance perspective.
Well, thanks. Well, we've got a few minutes now for audience questions, and we've had an awful lot of questions, so we'll try and whiz around them as quickly as we can. I think the first question, this is an interesting one. Cheick-Omar, perhaps you can take a look at this. Africa's known for having a long project life cycle. How do we reduce the life cycle?
Reduce the life cycle of a project?
Yeah.
I think that when we launch a project, it is based on some economics. And one key element is the duration of the project. So if you reduce the life cycle of a project, if it is of an existing project, you reduce the rentability of this project. So at the end of the day, this project becomes less attractive. So I think that it is, if we want to reduce, except if I did not understand very well the question, if it is to reduce the life cycle of a project, I'm not sure that it is really feasible, or it is easy to make it, because even if as operator you do it, okay, please, we should not forget that we are not in our country. We are operating in different countries, and these countries have their own strategy. So if one operator reduces the life cycle of his presence, it will be replaced by another operator at the end of the day, because the country will continue tapping and developing new oil projects, if we are talking about oil and gas projects. So one operator can reduce the life cycle, not of the project, but of his presence. But reducing the life cycle of this project, I'm not sure that I've seen that. It is the opposite. Most of the countries are looking for extending the life cycle of the project, in fact. If we are talking about it is not only in Africa, it is worldwide.
I think thank you, Cheick-Omar. I think we have a question, probably best start to Dr. Schroth. Renewables generally need to be large scale to make sense to investors, but that needs regional transmission lines. How do we ensure the support infrastructure is there and that the model makes economic sense?
Well, clearly, one of the key kind of aspects that we need to address is also increase the investments in the required transmission infrastructure and sort of the interconnections to create those regional markets that allow kind of to balance different resource endowments and also facilitate integration of larger shares, particularly of variable renewables from solar and energy. So from our side, we've been supporting over the years key transmission projects across the continent, whether that's the program for infrastructure development in Africa, PIDA, they're the transmission kind of aspects of it. We're currently working with the African Union and the African Union Development Agency, ODA-NEPAD, on the Continental Power System Master Plan. That is really, I've been identifying the key kind of missing links in terms of transmission across the continent. And we feel that this is a key aspect also for driving sort of the renewable energy generation dimension for Africa towards reaching the 300 gigawatt target as set at the Africa Climate Summit last year in Nairobi. Having said that, from our perspective, there's also a key role for the whole decentralized solutions. And we have been looking into ways moving away from sort of standalone kind of very small scale project into kind of sort of aggregation of different projects together, for example, through kind of structured tender processes where there are various sites, various mini grids that are then also attractive to kind of investors, potentially with some sort of elements of support like result-based financing or sort of demand risk mitigation instruments as well. I think there was one question in the chat as well around the Democratic Republic of Congo that I saw. which has a very significant, of course, energy access deficit, but also enormous opportunities for these kind of decentralized solutions. One example is we're working at the moment on actually a $340 million project, which is called the Moye Power Project, that will provide electricity through metro grids through 3 entire cities in the DRC. We just signed last Friday at the Africa Investment Forum the mandated lead arranger. We signed that mandate with the consortium for that project. We hope that can be financed next year. We feel that this is a model that can be aggregated or can be replicated across other parts, particularly of DRC, where you have actually cities of 60, 80, 100,000 people not being connected to the main transmission network, and there are opportunities sort of to provide access to electricity via sort of mini, or in this case, actually metro grids.
Sure, thank you. I think we have time for just one more question. Rolake, I think I'll come to you for this one. What does the panel think about the implications and challenges in the energy sector, the African energy sector, with President-elect Trump's plan to increase fossil fuel production and drill, baby drill in the USA?
Yeah, I was actually going to answer that one, even if you hadn't asked me, because it's something I've been asked recently. Well, look, America has an America First policy, which permeates every single thing from trade, bilateral trade negotiations, to energy sector policy, to supporting agriculture. I think what Africa needs to look at, I will take it from 2 or 3 perspectives. The first one is, you would have seen that OPEC Plus recently decided they would probably hold back on releasing additional supplies on global markets, anticipating a Trump move, as this question has described. I think potentially over the next couple of years, we will see perhaps muted oil prices. And I think African governments who rely heavily on oil benchmarking for their budgets need to think through strategically what their plans are going to be in terms of just the fiscal prudence and the economic management strategy. The second point around this is, for a long time, we have, as a continent, and specifically I speak to certain countries, lost opportunities to create markets for ourselves in other parts of the world, looking beyond North America. Qatar going into a 25 LNG contract with China, et cetera, et cetera. We need to start looking at global south to global south opportunities that allow us to leverage our competitive advantage across the energy value chain and partner with other countries on a more equal footing. But more importantly, within Africa itself, we need to create local demand through the infrastructure investment so that we can absorb the additional capacity that will be coming on stream. We've seen all the FIDs that you've mentioned that are being planned, that were announced this year. So there's a real need to look inward. And I think if we take the Dangote refinery as a microcosm of global oil politics, what Dangote stands for is that you can find an African country that has a competitive advantage and a key resource that then helps create not just a local demand, supply local demand, but also open up markets within the region. And I think Dangote recently started supplying into the West African market over 300,000 barrels a day. What that does, it creates new transport routes, it creates new infrastructure routes. It then perhaps starts to create an impetus for currency convertibility between African countries, the more they trade with each other. I think the bottom line, and the message I'm trying to drive home here, is that Africa's energy sector requires an Africa First policy. And that means sourcing capital from within the continent and not always being hugely reliant on external factors, and creating the demand here and absorbing our supplies here. I think I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Sure. Well, that's a very rousing note to end on. So thank you all to our panelists today, and to President Macky Sall for joining us for the fascinating interview earlier. And I think I just wish you all a good day now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye.